This quote by Utsa Patanek from her work The Republic of Hunger exposes the dubious and unreliable methods utilized by Western scholars when calculating the deaths that occurred during the Great Leap Forward, and questions the integrity of the Western studies, which proclaiming to be unbiased, remain the biggest truth fabricating machine in the West. Before going into details on the story in India, let us situate the story within the broader context of the past international approaches to hunger and famine. For this, I will take up two cases. The alleged massive famines in China during the Great Leap, 1958 to 61, and the intentionally unrecognized famine in Russia in the first half of the 1990s. When we look at these cases, it becomes clear enough that the entire field of discussion of hunger and famine is a highly ideological one and has been routinely characterized by the abandoning of the minimum academic criteria with respect to evidence and estimation. First, let us consider the allegation that 27 to 30 million people died in China during the Great Leap period. This alienation is contained in the books of two U.S. demographers, Ensley J. Cole and Judith Bannister. Few in the developing world, however, would have bothered to read the discussion of these demographers. Coached in technical language, the main popularizer, ardently uncritical supporter of the conclusions of these U.S. demographers has been Amrita K. Sen, and it was through Sen's writings, first in the New York Review of Books, and subsequently in his many lectures in books including Development as Freedom, that the world and the reading public in the country has been informed that China has had what is almost certainly the largest recorded famine in history, when 30 million people died in the famine that followed the Great Leap Forward. Whereas in India has not only had a famine since independence in 1947, the figure of 30 million has passed into popular folklore. However, a study of how it has been arrived at shows this estimate has no scholarly basis whatsoever. The facts are that there was a run of three bad harvests and a steep 30% drop in food grain output that took place in China in 1960. While the government's procurement from the villages did not decline, lowering availability per head, the official death rate, which had been falling up until 1958 owing to public health and sanitation measures, registered a rise to 25.4 thousand 25.4 per thousand in 1960. This peak famine death rate in China was however little different from India's actual normal death rate of 24.6 in the same year. The birth rate also fell steeply in 1958, mainly owing to labor mobilization for collective work. Two alternative routes have been used to estimate famine deaths, both of various dubious validity. In the first, the missing millions, totaling 27 million, the population pyramid during 58 to 61, have been identified with famine deaths. The problem with this is that not only the people who were actually living and who died in excess of normal numbers are included in the missing millions, but so are all those hypothetical persons included who were never born at all and who should have been born. If the birth rate had not fallen, this is not a common sense definition, nor is it a logical definition of famine deaths. For to die in a famine, a minimum necessary condition is to be born in the first place. The Chinese are highly talented people, but even they could not achieve the feat of dying without being born. If a person is told that 30 million people died, then quite correctly she would infer that those 30 million were alive and then died. The fact that 19 million of them never existed because they were never born in the first place is not conveyed by the formulation. Hence, there is a disingenuousness involved in saying that 30 million people died. It is an untrue preposition. The second route, followed by demographers Cole and Bannister, is perhaps even more dubious. They take the population totals yielded by the official 1953 and 1964 consensus in China to be correct, but dispute the official fertility rate as though it were based on some very large sample of 30 million persons at 5% of then population, especially canvassed along the 1953 census. The Nai Ruin Chen in 1966 had informed us. Instead, they used the much later census of 1982 study to project back very high fertility rates to the past, thus constructing an entirely hypothetical larger total of births between 53 and 64. If more people were born over the intercasual period of 53 to 64, correspondingly those extra people must have died over the same period. For both authors, despite rejecting every official vital rate, displayed touching faith in the absolute census population totals at these two dates. Hence, the official increase in population is kept unchanged, enabling them to assume exactly as many extra deaths as they assume extra births. With this procedure, the official figure of total deaths over the intercasual period was raised by a historic 60%. Both authors arbitrarily allocated the assumed higher numbers of deaths over the individual and intercasual years by assuming varying rates by which deaths were allegedly underreported during each of these years. In short, it was entirely up to the demographers to decide how many deaths he or she assigned to the Great Leap years. And the totally arbitrary nature of the procedure can be gauged by the fact that Cole raised the 1960 death rate to nearly 39, while Bannister raised it to 44.6 compared to the official death rate of 25.4. There is no reasonable basis for either figure. Nor is this all a linear time trend was then fitted by both. The deaths derived from a variable, the death rate, which has always behaved non-linearly. And the extent to which the arbitrarily constructed death rate was above this declining trend was then used to derive the total excess deaths, the figure between 27 million for Cole and 30 million for Bannister. We know that deaths in the population can never reach zero. So fitting linear trends makes no sense. The linear trend procedure implies that the Chinese population would have reached zero deaths and attained immortality in a few years. A remarkable achievement indeed, an impossible achievement outside the nonsensical statistical procedures followed by U.S. demographers. It is a travesty of the norms of academic integrity that grossly exaggerated estimates of famine deaths derived in this arbitrary manner that have been uncritically quoted and promoted, and that they enjoy so much currency. In any detailed critique, I have also shown that inconsistency of the peak of death rates constructed by Cole and Bannister with the food grain output availability figures in China. The calculations also show that the lowest possible availability figures we can get for China after taking into account government procurement is still higher than in India. And it is a puzzle why, given such much more egalitarian distribution, the death rate should have risen even to the officially declared level, because the internal political developments in China after 1978 were in the direction of attacking Maoist egalitarianism and the commune system. No repudiation from Chinese sources of the U.S. estimates are to be seen. In sharp contrast to the retrospective, patently ideological construction of hypothetical large famine deaths in China's Great Leap period, the publicizing of these figures, we find the demographic collapse in Russia in the first half of the 1990s has been met with a deafening silence from the academics. The estimation methods which they applied to China are not applied to them, to Russia. The facts are the so-called shock therapy to usher in capitalism under the advice of Western experts. Starting to see where this is going? It led to a catastrophic collapse of GDP in the former socialist states between 1990 and 96, as Table 1 summarizing the United Nations data shows. The GDP level was half or less in Russia and Ukraine by 1996 compared to a decade earlier, and collapsed to only one-fifth of the mid-80s level in Georgia. which was the worst affected. Never in peacetime have we ever seen such a comprehensive destruction of productive capacities and outputs, entirely owing to the wrong macroeconomic policies advised by foreign experts and followed by the local policymakers. The human effects have been devastating, with a sharp reversal of the decades of improvement in all human development indicators. The death rate among the able-bodied rose to nearly 49 to 58 per thousand. Comparing 1992 with 1990, rose a further 84 per thousand by 1994. The male expectation of life declined by nearly 6 years in Russia, with a steep rise in the death rate. The total population of Russia showed absolute decline. Again, an unprecedented situation in peacetime. Where were those academics who professed to be concerned with hunger and famine when it came to analyzing the economic and demographic collapse of Russia? It can hardly be argued that journalists and other media have no access to the country after 1990. I said earlier that it is not reasonable to count the effects of a decline in birth rate, if any, to estimate famine deaths. If we apply a reasonable method of simply taking the 1990 death rate in Russia as a benchmark and calculate the accumulated deaths, extra deaths among the able-bodied by 1996, owing to the observed rise in the death rate, we get a figure of more than 4 million excessive deaths in Russia alone. Expressed in relation to Russia's population, this famine was 3 times larger than the Great Bengal famine in India, 1943 to 44, and twice as large as the Chinese excess mortality, accepting the official figures, during the Great Leap Years. The Russian famine is neither internationally recognized nor publicized, for the very good reason that Russia was making transition to capitalism, and that it is this process which gave rise to the famine. Those who are eager to try to discredit socialism, even at the cost of indefensible statistical procedures, appear to be less than willing to recognize the existence of a famine or estimate famine deaths in a transitional society like Russia, even though the case is a contemporary one and is well documented.